On January 20th, 1969, Richard Nixon was inaugurated as the 37th President of the United States. The American people now wondered if he would divulge his secret plan to end the Vietnam War. They would have to wait until November 3rd for him to divulge his plan. In a speech given that night, he did finally divulge his plans for Vietnam.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to talk to you on a subject of deep concern to all Americans and to many people in all parts of the world, the war in Vietnam. Now let me begin by describing the situation I found when I was inaugurated on January 20. The war had been going on for 4 years. 31,000 Americans had been killed in action. The training program for the South Vietnamese was beyond schedule. 540,000 Americans were in Vietnam with no plans to reduce the number. No progress had been made at the negotiations in Paris, and the United States had not put forth a comprehensive peace proposal. The war was causing deep division at home and criticism from many of our friends as well as our enemies abroad. In view of these circumstances, there were some who urged that I end the war at once by ordering the immediate withdrawal of all American forces. From a political standpoint, this would have been a popular and easy course to follow. After all, we became involved in the war while my predecessor was in office. I could blame the defeat, which would be the result of my action, on him and come out as the peacemaker. Some put it to me quite bluntly. This was the only way to avoid allowing Johnson's war to become Nixon's war. But I had a greater obligation than to think only of the years of my administration and of the next election. I had to think of the effect of my decision on the next generation and on the future of peace and freedom in America and in the world. Let us all understand that the question before us is not whether some Americans are for peace and some Americans are against peace. The question at issue is not whether Johnson's war becomes Nixon's war. The great question is, how can we win America's peace? Well, let us turn now to the fundamental issue. Why and how did the United States become involved in Vietnam in the first place? 15 years ago, North Vietnam, with the logistical support of Communist China and the Soviet Union, launched a campaign to impose a communist government on South Vietnam by instigating and supporting a revolution. In response to the request of the government of South Vietnam, President Eisenhower sent economic aid and military equipment to assist the people of South Vietnam in their efforts to prevent a communist takeover. 7 years ago, President Kennedy sent 16,000 military personnel to Vietnam as combat advisors. 4 years ago, President Johnson sent American combat forces to South Vietnam. Now, many believe that President Johnson's decision to send American combat forces to South Vietnam was wrong, and many others, I among them, have been strongly critical of the way the war has been conducted. But the question facing us today is, now that we are in the war, what is the best way to end it? In January, I could only conclude that the precipitate withdrawal of all American forces from Vietnam would be a disaster not only for South Vietnam, but for the United States and for the cause of peace. For the future of peace, precipitate withdrawal would be a disaster of immense magnitude. A nation cannot remain great if it betrays its allies and lets down its friends. Our defeat and humiliation in South Vietnam, without question, would promote recklessness in the councils of those great powers who have not yet abandoned their goals of world conquest. This would spark violence wherever our commitments help maintain the peace. In the Middle East, in Berlin, eventually even in the Western Hemisphere. Ultimately, this would cost more lives. It would not bring peace. It would bring more war. For these reasons, I rejected the recommendation that I should end the war by immediately withdrawing all of our forces. I chose instead to change American policy on both the negotiating front and the battlefront. In order to end a war fought on many fronts, I initiated a pursuit for peace on many fronts. In a television speech on May 14 and a speech before the United Nations on a number of other occasions, I set forth our peace proposals in great detail. We have offered the complete withdrawal of all outside forces within 1 year. We have proposed a ceasefire under international supervision. We have offered free elections under international supervision, with the communists participating in the organization and conduct of the elections as an organized political force. And the Saigon government has pledged to accept the result of the election. We have not put forth our proposals on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. We have indicated that we're willing to discuss the proposals that have been put forth by the other side. We have declared that anything is negotiable, except the right of the people of South Vietnam to determine their own future. But the effect of all the public, private, and secret negotiations which have been undertaken since the bombing halt a year ago, and since this administration came into office on January 20th, can be summed up in one sentence: no progress whatever has been made except agreement on the shape of the bargaining table. In the previous administration, we Americanized the war in Vietnam. In this administration, we are Vietnamizing the search for peace. Under the new orders, the primary mission of our troops is to enable the South Vietnamese forces to assume the full responsibility for the security of South Vietnam. Our air operations have been reduced by over 20%. And now we have begun to see the results of this long overdue change in American policy in Vietnam. After 5 years of Americans going into Vietnam, we are finally bringing American men home. By December 15, over 60,000 men will have been withdrawn from South Vietnam, including 20% of all of our combat forces. The South Vietnamese have continued to gain in strength. As a result, they've been able to take over combat responsibilities from our American troops. Let me now turn to our program for the future. We have adopted a plan which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces and their replacement by South Vietnamese forces on an orderly, scheduled timetable. This withdrawal will be made from strength and not from weakness. As South Vietnamese forces become stronger, the rate of American withdrawal can become greater. My fellow Americans, I am sure you can recognize from what I have said that we really only have two choices open to us if we want to end this war. I can order an immediate, precipitate withdrawal of all Americans from Vietnam without regard to the effects of that action. Or we can persist in our search for a just peace through a negotiated settlement if possible, or through continued implementation of our plan for Vietnamization if necessary. A plan in which we will withdraw all of our forces from Vietnam on a schedule in accordance with our program as the South Vietnamese become strong enough to defend their own freedom. I have chosen this second course. It is not the easy way. It is the right way. It is a plan which will end the war and serve the cause of peace, not just in Vietnam, but in the Pacific and in the world. I want to end the war to save the lives of those brave young men in Vietnam. But I want to end it in a way which will increase the chance that their younger brothers and their sons will not have to fight in some future Vietnam someplace in the world. As president, I hold the responsibility for choosing the best path to that goal and then leading the nation along it. I pledge to you tonight that I shall meet this responsibility with all of the strength and wisdom I can command, in accordance with your hopes, mindful of your concerns, sustained by your prayers. Thank you and good night.
Nixon's plan to win America's peace would have a great effect on the 6th to the 27th Artillery in 1970. The battalion was short of personnel throughout 1969, and for the remainder of its service in Vietnam, that would remain the case. The battalion started in 1970 with some critical shortages. For example, 12 assistant gunners were authorized, but there were only 3 assigned. 8 mechanics helpers were authorized, but there were none assigned. Most critical was the authorization for 10 FDC computers, with only 4 assigned. The battalion reported that in the event that a battery is split in 2, FDCs were required to operate on a 24-hour basis. There is not a sufficient number of trained personnel to carry out the mission of the FDC in an efficient and safe manner. The order was given to find existing personnel with the highest aptitude area scores applicable to FDC operations, and to split the battalion survey teams to give each battery, FDC, an additional 3 personnel for on-the-job training. Cannoneers with high math ratings soon found themselves under special training in FDC. After Battery F, 16th Artillery was released from command under the 6th to the 27th Artillery on October 17, 1969, all 3 batteries, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, were now under 2 Field Forces artillery. In December 1969, the guns were beginning to be displaced to various temporary locations. Charlie Battery, displaced by convoy from Phuoc Vinh to Thunder 3, while the battery headquarters remained at Phuoc Vinh. Alpha Battery displaced a platoon of 8-inch howitzers from Quan Loi to LZ Marge, with headquarters remaining at Quan Loi. On 13 January 1970, a platoon of 175mm guns of Bravo Battery displaced by convoy from Phuoc Vinh, Camp Martin, for an artillery raid in the vicinity of Bu Gia Map airstrip. On 17 January, the 2 8-inch howitzers of Charlie Battery moved back to Phuoc Vinh from LZ Jake. Also, on this same day, Alpha Battery displaced a convoy of 8-inch howitzers from LZ Marge to Quan Loi, while the 175mm guns of Alpha Battery displaced by convoy from Quan Loi to LZ Jake. The next day, 18 January 1970, a platoon of 8-inch howitzers of Bravo Battery displaced by convoy from Phuoc Vinh to LZ Lee. It was beginning to seem like someone was playing musical chairs with the guns of the battalion. In the meantime, the 6 howitzers and 6 175mm guns fired 21,992 rounds of ammunition in 8,029 fire missions. Take a look at the movement of the battalion guns and howitzers in February and April 1970. During the months of February to April 1970, the battalion fired 26,768 rounds of ammunition during 10,162 fire missions. Army Lieutenant Colonel Dan H. Rawls became the new commander of the 6th Battalion, 27th Artillery on January 27, 1970, taking over the battalion from Lieutenant Colonel Leonard F. B. Reed, Jr. He was to have a difficult road ahead of him as the new commander.
Now, faced with these three options, this is the decision I have made. In cooperation with the armed forces of South Vietnam, attacks are being launched this week to clean out major enemy sanctuaries on the Cambodian-Vietnam border. A major responsibility for the ground operations is being assumed by South Vietnamese forces. For example, the attacks in several areas, including the Parrot's Beak that I referred to a moment ago, are exclusively South Vietnamese ground operations under South Vietnamese command, with the United States providing air and logistical support. There is one area, however, immediately above Parrot's Beak, where I have concluded that a combined American and South Vietnamese operation is necessary. Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. This key control center has been occupied by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong for 5 years in blatant violation of Cambodia's neutrality. This is not an invasion of Cambodia. The areas in which these attacks will be launched are completely occupied and controlled by North Vietnamese forces. Our purpose is not to occupy the areas. Once enemy forces are driven out of these sanctuaries, and once their military supplies are destroyed, we will withdraw.
As of April 30th, 1970, this, as noted, is where each of the units of the 6th to the 27th Artillery was located in South Vietnam. Notice that each battery has now been divided into 2 platoons with different locations. You should note that the platoon of 2 8-inch howitzers of Alpha Battery was at Fire Support Base Burkett, but they were soon ordered to move to Fire Support Base Wade near Loc Ninh to begin to support the Cambodian invasion. It was during this movement that the battalion suffered its 10th casualty. Ralph Porter, in his memory story about the accidental death of Specialist Roy Ransom on the website quanloi.org, stated, "We continued to fire in support of the 11th Armored Cavalry operations as it cleared through the near-border enemy base camps from our base at Fire Support Base Burkett from April to early May 1970. Eventually, these operations, working north, carried themselves out of our effective range for the 2 8-inch SP howitzers. On May 6, 1970, we were ordered to join up with the 2 175mm SP gun sections at Fire Support Base Wade, located in Loc Ninh, with a small ARVN base nearby the village of that same name, northeast of Fire Support Base Burkett and northwest of Quan Loi. Conditions remained hot and dry. We convoyed out on the same dirt road we came in on in a cloud of dust that limited visibility. I was traveling on the FDC 577 track with the medic and several of the FDC crew members. Security was a concern, and my job was to monitor the radio and act as the commo backup for the battery commander, who had a radio near the lead of our column in his Jeep. We were near the rear, traveling through a dried-up rice paddy area of lowland when we came to an abrupt stop. We hadn't gone more than 2 or 3 miles outside of Burkett. The driver and the passenger of the deuce-and-a-half truck that was in front of us came running back, calling for the medic who usually traveled with us, giving him access to the radios. While he gathered up his medical pack, they informed me that the 8-inch howitzer we had been following had disappeared off a bridge in the dust. I immediately informed the BC and the Air Observer that we had a problem with a howitzer. I was told to accompany the medic and report back when I could. We both sprinted down the road 40 meters or so to a small bridge. I was awestruck by the scene, almost surreal. One of our beloved 8-inch SP howitzers was upside down on the opposite edge of a creek. It had flipped in the air for a 15 to 20 foot drop, the rear half in the water, the front half in the muck of an embankment. It had gone off the right side of the primitive bridge. The medic and I jumped down to lend assistance to the injured. I found the section chief, Staff Sergeant Archie Jones, tending to my FDC section chief, Specialist 5 Reed McDonald, who had hitched a ride with the gun section. He was badly injured by being pinned under the edge of the track. Reed was positioned on a relatively flat, dry area for the medic to tend to his injuries, and he was in much pain. I began organizing the recovery efforts while Staff Sergeant Jones helped the medic. We needed a count of how many were on the track and where they now were. The initial report I got was 2 were missing. In a frenzy, we quickly combed through the muddy water looking for the people and equipment and swept up the embankment to the bushes on the far side. We found nothing. I gathered everybody back at the start, just under the spot where the track had fallen off the bridge. I posted someone with a rifle to go into the bushes and weeds on the far side high ground to look further out and hold a spot for security. We recounted at this time and were missing only one, Specialist 4 Roy Ransom. Maybe 5 or 6 of us were now on hands and knees, feeling through the water and around the edges of the track. The medic came to me and reported that Reed was probably suffering a broken pelvis and God knows what other internal injuries. The medic had administered 1 shot of morphine. I asked if he was bleeding. Nothing but some scratches external, the medic replied. I asked then, why does the medic need me? The real worry here was shock. We were in agreement. He wanted to give Reed another shot of morphine due to the extreme pain. We discussed the effect that this might have on shock. The medic was unsure. I told him I didn't have the training to make such a decision. The real problem was that after 2 shots of morphine, any others could be deadly. I knew that Reed had at least an hour ride in a helicopter to get to a hospital, probably more. He lay writhing in pain, and we still needed to lift him up to the road to take him to an area accessible to a helicopter. I gave permission with the proviso that he mark the number of shots in more ways than 1. Reed was marked with pen and tags, documenting 2 shots of morphine, and thankfully he was asleep the last time I saw him. I returned to the search area to help, and almost immediately one of the guys said he had found Roy Ransom. He was dead. He'd been pinned under the spade across the midsection of his back and driven deep underwater, face down. I'm sorry I don't remember who found his body because it was somewhat traumatic for him too. I was uncomfortable with just one of us pronouncing someone dead, yet the medic was busy doing other important things. I asked that he keep his head out of the water so I could also look, and then did so, checking closely for movement in his iris and any breathing signs. I remember that I did this, but the vision was blocked because it was grisly, and I thought highly of this fine, hard-working, quiet soldier. He died instantly with the force of tons of steel on him, but that was only a minuscule consolation for his family. That's all I remember of this whole sad incident. We then discussed making an attempt to dig out around Roy to dislodge his body. Shortly, the aerial observer, our battalion executive officer, Major Clay, appeared on the bridge and asked for my report. I told him the situation, and he ordered all of us out of the creek and into our vehicles. We were obviously reluctant to abandon our gun and comrade, so he took the time to explain that the engineers were on the way. There was nothing more we could do. To disturb the gun was too dangerous if the weight shifted. I've always been thankful that he was sensitive enough to realize the emotional situation and helped rather than ignored it. Ralph Porter also recalled, Fire Support Base Wade put Alpha Battery back together in early May 1970. The Cambodian operation, a limited invasion, would soon be brought to a successful end with mountains of captured weapons and food taken to Quan Loi for distribution elsewhere. Most of the GIs thought that the operation had been a success. Disruption of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the main infiltration route, along with destruction of the enemy base camps, would buy us some time. The intelligence gathered from seized documents and numerous Chu Hoi surrenders would be helpful for months. On July 15, 1970, Lieutenant Colonel George G. Mays assumed command of the battalion from Lieutenant Colonel Dan H. Rawls. The battalion had just returned from operations in Cambodia, and Lieutenant Colonel May immediately launched an intensive maintenance program. The battalion successfully passed the annual general inspection in August. Following cross-border operations in Cambodia, the battalion occupied positions in northern Bin Long and Phuc Long provinces. Fire bases such as Budap, Wade, Haymaker, Alpha, Beverly II, and Song Bay became synonymous with the 6th of the 27th. The battalion supported cross-border operations conducted by ARVN maneuver units from the 5th, 18th, and 25th ARVN divisions, the 3rd Armored Brigade, and the 3rd, 5th, and 6th ARVN Ranger groups. In addition to providing tactical support and constructing semi-permanent fire bases, the batteries conducted numerous artillery raids, attacking VC units both in South Vietnam and Cambodia.
You're hearing it on the music machine with the Quan Loi Kid. Hi out there. It's wet, isn't it? 9:15 is the time. And hello to Andy over there at 15th Med. And hello to all the guys in Andy's Hooch who are there now getting inebriated and intoxicated. This song goes out to those drunks there at Andy's Hooch. Yeah, you'll remember that hangover tomorrow, you guys. Believe me.
I walk along the city streets.
That was a small sample of a new radio station that came to Quan Loi Base Camp in late February 1970. Soon the Quan Loi Kid was the talk of the base camp, and fellow Quan Loyers could not believe we had our own radio station playing American rock and roll music. How did that happen? Colonel Jim Braden, former commander of the 11th Armored Cavalry Troop at Quan Loi in 1969 to 1970, related how it came about in an email to me at quanloi.org in March 2009. Jim wrote, "When the 1st Division began going home, I was standing on the road by the airstrip at Quan Loi, watching an incoming convoy, when a 1st Division Jeep pulled over and stopped. A sergeant dismounted from the Jeep and asked me if we wanted a radio station. I asked what the hell was he talking about, and he told me he had a high-powered AM/FM radio station with several hundred records at Lai K, and they needed a new home." Since the Armed Forces Network was hard to receive at Quan Loi, I sent him to our mess hall and told him to grab some chow and wait until I talked with Colonel Starry, the 11th ACR regimental commander. I was intercepted by the regimental XO, who wanted to know why I wanted to see the CO, and when I told him why, he said we didn't want it. I got on the radio and called Colonel Starry, and he said, "Hell yes." I returned to the troop area and asked the sergeant how soon he could move up to Quan Loi, and his answer was right away, but. The but was that we would need a couple of big transformers to make it work. I told the sergeant to wait again, and went to see the S4, and he said he did not know where we could find what we needed. Somehow, the Air Force Forward Air Controller got wind of the conversation and told us to give him a couple of hours, and he would see if he could find what we needed. I sent for the sergeant, and he told the Air Force Forward Air Controller what we needed. The FAC called someone back down south, got a positive response, and a C-130 landed the next afternoon and dumped 2 generators on the ramp. Meanwhile, the sergeant, after contacting his folks at Lai K and telling them to pack ASAP, went south with the next day's convoy. He returned with everything with the next northbound convoy, and we put him on the top floor of the White House. They went on air late that afternoon as Radio Free Black Horse, WACR Quan Loi, the only real Cav in the whole AO. While it lasted, it was great to hear a simulation of everyone's radio station back in the world, along with listening to American popular music on the radio at Quan Loi and disc jockeys like the Quan Loi Kid. In late June or early July 1970, as Quan Loi no longer became the home of the 11th ACR, the radio station moved to Da Tiang Base Camp, home of the 25th Infantry Division, and became WTLB, Radio Tropic Lightning Brigade.
Make the time 21 minutes after 9 o'clock. It's a soggy Saturday night here in Quan Loi. Makes it that much more fun to be here, right, guys? This song goes out to Medevac 1-2 over there at 37th Med. It's the number 4 sound in Quan Loi country. Love grows where my rosemary goes. There are some other groovy things that rhymes with that, too, huh, Rosemary?
She ain't got the money, clothes are kind of funny, her hair is kind of wild and free. Oh, for love grows where my rosemary goes, and nobody knows like me.
On January 16, 1971, Lieutenant Colonel Albert E. Wolfgang assumed command of the 6th to the 27th Artillery from Lieutenant Colonel George G. Mays. Lieutenant Colonel Wolfgang would command a battalion that continued to support both U.S. and ARVN units in 3 Corps. On January 5, 1971, the 6th to the 27th Artillery was reassigned from 2 Field Force Vietnam Artillery to their old friends at the 23rd Artillery Group. With this reorganization, the tactical missions for each of the 3 firing batteries was general support reinforcing the 5th ARVN Division Artillery. By the end of March 1971, the assigned personnel strength of the battalion was above the authorized. However, shortages existed in certain MOSs. The year 1971 brought another shift in the Vietnamization concept. Since the promulgation of the Vietnamization program in November 1969, the basis for Vietnamization had been training programs and combined operations, conceived and controlled by Americans. By 1971, the American troop strength in Vietnam had been halved, and it became apparent that the capability of U.S. units to directly support training programs was fast diminishing. At the same time, American commanders felt that if Vietnamese forces were to become self-reliant, they would have to provide the training impetus for themselves. Assistance was offered only as needed and required. This shift in policy produced some hopeful indications as the Vietnamese began to assume the initiative in meeting most of their requirements. On February 24, 1971, the battalion suffered its 11th casualty. Specialist 5 Arthur K. Kawachika was a food service specialist serving with Headquarters Battery, 6th Battalion, 27th Artillery, U.S. Army, Republic of Vietnam. On February 24, 1971, Kawachika sustained a gunshot wound to the head at Han Quan Special Forces Camp, 2 kilometers, 1.2 miles, southwest of An Loc Airfield in Bin Long Province, Republic of Vietnam. He was found on the floor of a room in the billets at the Air Warning Control Center with his assigned F-16 rifle beside him. Kawachika was taken to the 93rd Evacuation Hospital at Long Bin, where medical staff declared him dead on arrival. He was 24 years old. The body was forwarded to the U.S. Army mortuary at Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base and released to Graves registration personnel. After processing, it was transported to Hawaii, where he was laid to rest. A casualty report dated May 18, 1971, ruled Kawachika's death to be self-inflicted. These were difficult times for the 6th to the 27th Battalion personnel. The battalion could have been nicknamed the Gypsy Battalion due to the number of times the 3 firing batteries relocated in support of U.S. and ARVN troops. In 1970, Alpha Battery relocated 14 times, Bravo 15 times, and Charlie Battery an unbelievable 20 times. Think of the work involved in a battery move. Everything had to be dismantled and loaded, transported, and then rebuilt. It was a difficult life to be a cannoneer with the 6th of the 27th Artillery. In the last 18 months, the battalion remained in South Vietnam. During 1970, the drawdown of U.S. units accelerated. The number of non-divisional artillery battalions in Military Region 3 Corps was progressively reduced through redeployment. At peak strength, 2 Field Forces Artillery headquarters had consisted of the 23rd and 54th Artillery Groups, and a total of 4 heavy battalions, consisting of 3 40mm Duster batteries and a quad 50 machine gun battery. By the end of 1970, the number of battalions had been reduced from 13 to 7. The 6th to the 27th was still one of these battalions. On April 18, 1971, the battalion suffered its 12th casualty. Gabriel Lawrence Two Eagle, a Native American from Upper Cut Meat Community, Rosebud, South Dakota, joined the U.S. Army on March 18, 1970 at Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He began his tour of duty in Vietnam on August 6, 1970, as a part of Battery C 6 Battalion, 27th Artillery, 23rd Artillery Group. As with a number of soldiers in Vietnam at this time, Gabriel may have developed a drug use habit. Drugs were easy to get in Vietnam and were inexpensive. He was found dead 1 kilometer west of Phu Loi Airfield in Hao Ngai Province, South Vietnam, on April 18, 1971. After an investigation, it was determined he died as a result of suffocation due to a drug overdose. Gabriel Lawrence Two Eagle was buried with military honors at White Horse Cemetery in Upper Cut Meat Community, South Dakota. Gabriel is honored on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. By April 1971, the 3 batteries were stationary, and reporting was the number of rounds fired to certain locations from those positions. Headquarters and service battery were still at Phu Loi. Alpha was at Budap, Bravo at Loc Ninh, and Charlie at Fire Support Base Haymaker. On May 10, 1971, the battalion suffered its 13th casualty. Specialist 5 Mickey L. Wilson was a cannon fire direction specialist serving with Battery B, 6th Battalion, 27th Artillery, 23rd Artillery Group. On May 10, 1971, Specialist 5 Wilson died in what the Army termed a vehicle accident. His mother, Mrs. Wilson, stated that they did not get any real details other than it was an accident involving a trailer. In 1972, Mrs. Wilson stated one of Mickey's hooch mates from Vietnam came to Odessa, Texas to see them. This friend told them he was on R&R when Mickey was killed, but according to the talk that was going on when he returned to the battery, Mickey had fallen into the wheel well of a truck and was run over. The Wilson family did not accept this version, as they felt that Mickey was too sure-footed. However, in 2005, a fellow artilleryman from the unit contacted Mrs. Wilson and informed her that he was a witness to the accident. He stated the battery had been surrounded by enemy forces and that the upper command had decided that the unit would destroy the artillery and armored personnel support equipment and would be helicopter lifted out of the area. However, the 1st Cavalry was able to penetrate the zone and give Mickey's unit a path way out. So, the unit loaded up the artillery and armored personnel carriers on lowboy trailers and started a night move on a very dark, moonless night. It had been raining and drizzling all day and into the night. As the convoy was moving slowly out of the zone, Mickey was riding on a lowboy trailer that was hauling an armored personnel carrier, which was used for the 1st Directional Command, to which Mickey was assigned. Mickey crawled up the gooseneck to offer the driver a soda, and as he was attempting to slide down the gooseneck, he lost his balance and fell underneath the trailer and was run over. Witnesses stated that Mickey looked up at the guys, smiled, and died. This was taken from the Kofelt database and a veteran's memory. On June 1, 1971, the battalion experienced its 14th and final casualty. PFC Robert Robbie P. Sanchez Jr. served with Alpha Battery, 6th Battalion, 27th Artillery. In late spring 1971, Alpha Battery was located at Fire Support Base Buttons, 2 miles south of Phuc Bin, at Song Bay, in Phuc Long Province, where it had recently been redeployed from a fire base near the Cambodian border. Upon his arrival with Alpha Battery, PFC Sanchez was put on the night shift and trained for duties in the Fire Direction Center, the FDC. These responsibilities included computing gunfire data, telecommunications, and political, military, civilian, and aviation clearances for firing the big guns. The artillerymen in Alpha Battery were billeted in structures comprised of 72-inch culvert half-pipes made of corrugated steel. For added protection, they covered them with 3 layers of sandbags. After midnight on June 1, 1971, they were called to a red alert when a nearby Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN fire base, was being assaulted by the enemy. About an hour later, an all clear was sounded, and they returned to their bunks. It was at this time Sanchez was found dead at his bed with a self-inflicted wound to the head from his assigned M16 rifle. The following morning, a CID team came by helicopter from Long Bin and conducted an investigation. When they finished, they bagged Sanchez's remains and returned to Long Bin with his body. On the 22nd of July, 1971, a change of command once again took place, and Lieutenant Colonel Neil A. Menzies assumed command of the battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Menzies would be the last 6th to the 27th Artillery Battalion commander. In July of 1971, Bravo Battery turned in its equipment, and the battery's guidon was redeployed to Fort Lewis, Washington, for inactivation. Battery C was located at Fire Support Wade, near the town of Loch Ninh, in support of the ARVN 5th Infantry Division, which was conducting cross-border operations near the Cambodian village of Snow. A number of hard-fought engagements between NVA divisions and ARVN units occurred during that period. To maximize the use of the small number of U.S. artillery batteries remaining in Military Region 3, Battery A was split into 2 firing platoons. One platoon supported the 2nd Squadron 11th ACR in Bin Dong and Tay Ninh provinces, while the other platoon was deployed approximately 60 miles to the east near the city of Xuan Loc at Fire Support Base Olesan in support of the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Air Cavalry Division. Thus, with only 2 firing batteries remaining in Vietnam, the battalion was supporting ARVN forces and the only U.S. maneuver units located in Military Region 3. Unfortunately, the 6th to the 27th Artillery Battalion did not return to the United States as a group as it had arrived in 1965 on the U.S. Navy ship Gordon. In July 1971, Bravo Battery turned in its equipment, and the battery's guidon was redeployed to Fort Lewis, Washington for inactivation. Charlie Battery soon followed suit. Then only headquarters, service, and 2 platoons of Alpha Battery remained in Vietnam. On 18 October 1971, the remaining batteries of the 6th Battalion, 27th Artillery commenced redeployment operations, and all equipment was turned in through supply channels. The majority of the personnel subsequently departed for CONUS for separation from the Army and reassignment, while approximately 1/3 of the officers and men were reassigned to units in Vietnam. Redeployment operations were completed on 20 November 1971, and the colors were sent to Fort Lewis, Washington for inactivation, thus closing another proud and brilliant chapter in the history of the 6th Battalion, 27th Field Artillery, Vietnam.